The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, is now recognized to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first would like to also recognize Mr. Posey as a co-sponsor of this amendment and thank him for his work with this. Oh, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment to H.R. 3817, offered by Mr. Meeks of New York and Mr. Posey. At the end of Title IV, insert the following new section. Section 414, streamlining of...
Ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said, I want to recognize Mr. Posey as a co-sponsor of this amendment. This amendment, simply put, sets reasonable deadlines on the SEC to be responsive to rule changes proposed by self-regulatory organizations or SROs. These include primarily clearinghouses and exchanges. The reason for proposing this amendment has to do with a common charge of lack of responsiveness and failure of the SEC to have clear deadlines to respond to rule changes. Similar deadlines and procedure clarifications at the CFTC have helped increase efficiency there and allowed the CFTC to focus resources on matters of greater systemic significance. This amendment says that the official clock to approval starts ticking after an SRO has submitted the requisite paperwork to the SEC and published details about the intended rule change online for all to see. If after 3 days of receiving the application document, the SEC does not respond to the SRO clarifying that the file is incomplete and how to fix it, then the SEC has 1 month to issue a ruling on the rule change. It may extend that time period to 90 days or even up to 180 days to publish the reasons for rejection of a rule change and to allow for a hearing on the matter. If the SEC fails to meet these deadlines by either failing to request an extension or failing to issue a ruling with justification, then a rule is considered approved. The SEC may also suspend this rule change after these deadlines have passed and after the rule changes have been implemented if the appropriate regulatory agency finds that such rules change is inconsistent with the safety and soundness of the organization, if it violates some other regulatory requirement, or if it possesses a systemic risk. This amendment therefore revokes the right of the SEC to become a regulatory black box with no deadlines, no minimum standards of accountability and responsiveness. As we expand the regulatory oversight of this and other regulators, it will be critical that they in turn be able to demonstrate efficiency by achieving better resource allocation to manage systemic risk, ensure adequate consumer protection, and yet not become an operational burden on the companies and organizations they oversee. In short, as we expand the powers of many of our regulators, it is reasonable that we ask them to become better and more responsive and focused in return. It matters to the stability of the overall financial system and to the continued competitiveness of American financial institutions. And also, Mr. Chairman, I have had dialogue with a number of individuals, and I would like to introduce an amendment with a commitment further to work with the chair and others to make sure that there will be a minor technical edits, acknowledging that this does not apply to member conduct, member capital, and discipline. That's an agreement that we've had with a number that we're working on this bill, and before it hits the floor, we will make sure that those technical amendments are taken care of. I yield back.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes to say, well, let me wait. The gentleman from Florida was the co-author. Does the gentleman from Florida wish to be heard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Meeks. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer my support to the Meeks Amendment. The effective deployment of the SEC's regulatory resources have been challenged by the unprecedented complexity of today's financial markets, the collapse of major investment banks, failures in the lightly regulated credit and over-the-counter derivatives markets, and criminal conduct by brokers. The proposed amendment would free the SEC from the ministerial task of processing exchange filings for publication in the Federal Register, would impose clear deadlines for SEC action, and would clarify the scope of rule changes that can take effect without prior SEC approval. Any efforts to streamline and improve SEC operations should be encouraged. Today, exchanges are burdened with a statute that requires SEC to review every single rule, policy, practice, and procedure for each and every register and exchange. Capital can go anywhere, and as we have heard from experts here earlier today many times, it will flood to London and Asia with more responsive regulators if we do not improve the efficiency of our regulators. This amendment would impose clear deadlines for SEC action. The SEC will still have the ability to initiate proceedings for disapproval and hearings, but they will need to be more accountable and more responsive. I ask my colleagues to support these changes to the SEC as we move forward with this bill in its entirety.
I recognize myself to say that I appreciate the spirit, but we've heard in the SEC with some specific problems. In particular, for instance, they say that, well, what I'm told is that 1,400 rules recently, all but 21 were done within the 35 days, but they did have some serious issues there. The SEC is asking, and I would pass this along, for a chance to work with the gentleman on this between now and the floor, agreeing with the basic principle. But I was hoping the gentleman could withdraw this with the instruction from us to the SEC to work with him, and whatever he later comes up with, we will entertain. But they believe they could do some refinements. I yield to the gentleman.
I'm always willing to work with the chair, and there's a firm, and I know that there's a firm.
The gentleman, let me put it this way, whatever the gentleman decides to reoffer will be in order as far as, and I can guarantee that, but I think between now and then we probably can come to some agreement with the SEC with a little prod. So the amendment is withdrawn.